worldly people, welcome back to another Story Study Saturday. I'm Sammy, and I'm a writer who likes to learn about writing through reading and a little bit extra research and share what I learn with you to help make other writers better writers. So today I want to talk to you about From Blood and Ash. And I want to start off by saying I was recommended this book by my friend who hadn't finished reading it, and she knows that I do this, so if there is a book that I think someone should DNF, I would let her know. And I will say I totally understand why she was having a hard time getting started, but we'll get into that later. So I want to thank her for letting me know that I should read this book. Let's talk about my thoughts. I will say with full confidence that chapters 1 through 3 are rough. We're introduced to this whole world in chapter 1. We get all of the history, all of the characters, important details, all of everything that we could possibly need to know in chapter 1 in the most word vomity way. It's rough because in chapter 1, we were in a place. There was things happening in the present. It wasn't just like, hey, here's all the exposition that you need to know. We'll gradually introduce you to your characters. Through this exposition, it was like we were in a scene, and every once in a while, the main character who we get first person narration through is just like randomly thinking about the history of the world. And I hate that. That's like my least favorite way of giving exposition. I want you to show me the exposition or tell me the exposition in a way that makes sense. I actually went into this a little bit in my show don't tell video, so you can take a look at that if you haven't seen it before. And then I will say, once chapter 4 started, that's when it started to really get into the meat of the story, and a lot of really interesting things started happening. We got to the inciting incident, we got to introduce new characters, we got this great dialogue and really just awesome character interactions, and we started to feel like everybody was their own individual person, and there was drama and conflict and all of the things that make a story good. It's just we had to work so hard to get to it. And I honestly, if we started off in a way that wasn't so painful, I probably would have given this book 5 stars, but I ended up giving it like a solid 3.5. Genuinely. I also thought it was a little bit predictable, but I don't know if it was predictable because I'm smart or if it was predictable because of the writing. About like 30% in, I made a guess, and then the guess was right. And then like, I don't know, 60% in, I made a more specific guess, and then that guess was given to me at like 85% that I was right. I don't know if I was just taught to look for the clues through all of the reading that I've done, but I found all of the clues really easy. The kind of things that pop up when you go through a reread and you're like, I should have known when it says. I found all of those on my first go. So I don't know if that's that the clues were a little too blatant or if it was that I just was smarter than the clues. So there's that. So let's talk about what I think this book can improve on. Even though my thoughts kind of touched on some of those things, I would say exposition. It can definitely improve on. How I would probably have done this is I would have introduced the character in a different setting than the one that she is introduced in. She's in a brothel, or like a bar/brothel in her first scene. And that's so much more interesting than the history. So if you introduced her in a scene that wasn't as like engaging for the present, if she was like at home reading a book or something, like doing some of her maiden homework, that might have been more like doable to be able to deal with the exposition, because that way the exposition makes sense for what the character is doing. If you're reading the history of Solus and then you start thinking about the history of Solus, it makes way more sense than if you're playing cards at a bar and you start thinking about the history of Solus. I'm fine with you telling me what the world building is, as long as it's from a motivated perspective. I think a very great example of this that does the same thing but very differently is The Beginning of Legend by Marie Lu. We needed to know what the trials were in that story. And instead of saying all of the like history of these are the things, these are the things, we have the main character's perspective, and he's looking at his little brother who has to go through the trials. And because he's looking at his little brother, we have that trigger for the exposition, and then we get the exposition because we have questions in that moment, and then they answer the questions. It's not, hey, I'm playing cards with these guards and they don't know who I am, and it's pretty great and I'm having a great time. Also, here's how everything came to be. It's so jarring, and there were like pages and pages and pages of exposition only to give me like a paragraph and a half maybe of the present. And that was not, I was so invested in what was happening in the present that I was like ready to throw my Kindle because there were so many pages of exposition. And then we would just blip right back into the actual scene. And I'm like, so I think that is something that could be improved for sure. The exposition dump could have been spread over several chapters. We didn't need it all in the first chapter. We didn't need it in that specific setting, and giving it some more motivation for why the character is thinking the exposition would have made it a lot stronger. A lot of people writing reviews for this say like, I almost DNF'd it at 16% and I'm glad I didn't, or I did DNF it because that was, oh my god, so bad. Exposition is really, really hard to navigate in a fantasy world like this, so making sure that it's motivated by something in the actual scene makes it a lot easier for readers to not be like, wow, there's so much extra information here. Why? Why is there so much? And I would say another thing that I think could be improved is a little bit more subtlety. I don't know if that's it's fully necessary or if it's just me, but maybe like a few less hints, less blatant, like common trope hints, maybe making them a little bit more unique towards the setting, that they aren't as pointed out, and something that's a little bit more buried and not in dialogue. Probably would make it a little bit better, but I'd still got enjoyment out of the twist that I had guessed. But I don't know if I would have gotten more if I hadn't guessed it, or if I just got that like, yeah, I called it kind of vibe out of it. So what do I think we can learn from this book? Dialogue can make or break your story. The dialogue in this story is so good. I am so impressed by the dialogue. The characters have this witty banter, and it's just so much fun to read, and their dynamic is great, and I'm just like thriving from it. It's just great. And even with the scenarios that the characters are in, you get multiple different kinds of dialogue, and they're still in character for who they are, just depending on the setting. And it's really nice to see those contrasts and differences, and the way that their dialogue just strengthens our understanding of the character. It doesn't take away from it at all, and it's just really, really, really well done. I feel very strongly that this book has a great example of really great dialogue. The dialogue, I think, is enough to just carry the story through. And the dialogue, I think, is all the story needs to make it what it is. While there is a lot more world building and character development that adds to it, the dialogue nails it all home. It's fantastic. I will also say I'm not usually a fan of books with smut. They usually make me super uncomfortable. They usually have so much detail that I don't find necessary, and that detail is what makes me super uncomfortable. So I think that even though this book has some in it, it's not blatant. It's sort of like, hey, here's sort of here's a nudge. Like I feel like it's in between YA and NA, if you know what I mean. So like NA is usually like, hey, heavy, you know exactly what's going on. There are no details that you miss. You know what it looks like, you know what it smells like, you know all of it. And I don't need to know all of it, but this was very gentle in terms of the amount of detail that it gave about what was going on. And I appreciated that because I can use my imagination. I don't want you to tell me what's happening. I don't need to know exactly what's happening, but it was just so, it wasn't like fade to black kind of. It was like, here's how it's kind of going. You can stick the pieces together if you want to, or you can just stick with this like foggy sort of, it's blurred out. you don't need to know everything that's going on. And I appreciated that because it was a lot easier to just go through because I didn't have to think about like, oh my god, if I talk about this book, somebody's gonna be like, oh my god, she reads smut for fun. But I don't. That's all I'm gonna say on that. So I think we can take that, is that your smut doesn't have to be super, super detailed. Those are the things I think we can learn for sure from this book. I am very, very excited to read the other 2 books that are out. I've got the second one on my Kindle ready to go, and I am ready to continue, but I understand how it's difficult to get started. I think that that's just something that is easy to work around after a little bit of practice. And once you get into a series, you don't have to info dump at the beginning of any of the books anymore. So I think the next 2 books should be a lot better because we don't have to be invited into the world the same way that we did with this book. So I guess that's all I've got to say about From Blood and Ash. I do want to ask you guys what you think about it. If you've read it, if you got past that first 3 chapter period where everything was kind of like hard and muddy to get through. Tell me your thoughts down below. Let's have a little book chat, and I will see you on Tuesday for another Writing Tip Tuesday. If you don't want to miss any of my videos, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell next to it. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It'll really help me out. And I'm gonna go and pretend I didn't say the word smut as many times as I did. So I will see you guys on Tuesday. I don't want to talk about smut this much. There's so much. I'm talking about it way too much.